He looked like the last person who should be teaching self-defense. The group of suburban mothers gathered in the community center's multipurpose room exchanged skeptical glances as the overweight, grey-haired man in his early 60s shuffled to the front of the room. His polo shirt stretched tight over a beer belly, and he moved with the careful gait of someone whose best athletic days were decades behind him. "This is our instructor?" one of them whispered. "He looks like he'd lose a fight with a flight of stairs." The man said nothing, just stood quietly at the front of the room, hands clasped behind his back in a way that seemed oddly formal. But when three young gang members burst through the doors 20 minutes later, looking for easy targets to rob, something ancient and lethal awakened behind his tired eyes, and you would have sworn you were watching a different person entirely. Saturday morning at the Riverside Community Center in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. The women's self-defense workshop had attracted 23 participants, mostly mothers from the surrounding neighborhoods who wanted to learn basic protection techniques after a recent string of purse snatchings in the area. The workshop was free, sponsored by the local police department as part of their community outreach program. Frank Mitchell had volunteered to teach the class after seeing a flyer at the grocery store. At 61 years old, he was soft around the middle, had grey hair that was thinning on top, and wore wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a retired accountant rather than any kind of physical instructor. He'd been living quietly in Phoenix for the past 8 years, working part-time at a hardware store and spending his evenings watching television or reading paperback novels. The community center director, Sandra Williams, had been initially hesitant to accept Frank's volunteer application. He had no visible credentials as a martial arts instructor, no background in law enforcement, and frankly, he didn't look like someone who could defend himself, much less teach others how to do it. But volunteers were hard to find, and Frank had been persistent in his offers to help. The women who showed up for the Saturday morning workshop ranged in age from their late 20s to their 60s. Most were mothers concerned about personal safety while running errands or walking in parking lots. A few were college students who wanted to learn basic defensive techniques. All of them had expected to be taught by someone who looked more capable of demonstrating physical techniques. Sarah Chun, a 34-year-old marketing executive, nudged her friend Jessica Martinez as Frank introduced himself. "Are we sure this guy knows what he's doing?" she whispered. "He looks like my dad trying to get back in shape." Martinez, who had been skeptical about the workshop from the beginning, shook her head. "Maybe we should have paid for a real self-defense class. This guy looks like he'd have trouble opening a jar of pickles." The third member of their group, Amanda Rodriguez, was more diplomatic but equally concerned. "I'm sure he means well, but I was hoping to learn from someone with actual training." Frank heard their whispered comments but showed no reaction. He'd been hearing variations of the same doubts for most of his adult life. First from drill sergeants who thought he looked too soft for military service. Later from fellow soldiers who questioned whether he belonged in elite units. And finally from civilians who couldn't see past his unremarkable appearance to the capabilities that lay beneath. "Good morning, ladies," Frank said, his voice carrying clearly through the room without seeming raised or forced. "Thank you all for taking the time to learn some basic personal protection techniques. Before we begin, I'd like each of you to think about why you're here. What situation are you hoping to be better prepared for?" The women shared their concerns, walking to their cars at night, jogging alone, dealing with aggressive strangers, protecting their children in public spaces. Frank listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, his expression serious and attentive. "What most of you are describing," Frank said when they'd finished, "are situations where awareness and avoidance are your best defenses. Physical techniques should always be a last resort, used only when you can't escape or de-escalate a dangerous situation." He began with basic awareness training, teaching them how to scan their environment, how to identify potential threats before they became immediate dangers, how to position themselves in public spaces to maintain escape routes. His instruction was methodical and practical, focusing on real-world application rather than flashy techniques. But the women remained skeptical. The techniques he was teaching were sensible, but they wanted to see him demonstrate physical defensive moves. How could they trust instruction from someone who looked like he'd be winded after climbing a flight of stairs? John decided to voice what everyone was thinking. "Mr. Mitchell, not to be rude, but could you show us some actual defensive techniques? Like, what would you do if someone grabbed you from behind?" Frank paused for a moment, considering her request. Physical demonstrations weren't really necessary for what he'd planned to teach, but he understood their need to have confidence in their "Instructor, I'd be happy to demonstrate," he said. "But I want to emphasize again that these techniques should only be used when you absolutely cannot escape or avoid a confrontation." He called for a volunteer and Rodriguez reluctantly stepped forward. "Stand behind me and grab me around the chest, like someone trying to restrain you from behind," Frank instructed. Rodriguez approached hesitantly and wrapped her arms around Frank's chest in what she thought was a firm hold. Before she could even register what was happening, Frank had broken her grip, turned, and gently but firmly guided her off balance and onto the mat they'd laid out for demonstrations. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds and involved no visible force or aggressive movement. The women stared in silence. What they'd just witnessed didn't match their expectations of either violence or self-defense instruction. There had been no dramatic throws or strikes, no shouting or obvious displays of strength. Frank had simply moved in a way that made Rodriguez's attempt to hold him completely ineffective. "That was surprisingly smooth," Martinez admitted. "Can you teach us how to do that?" Frank helped Rodriguez to her feet and began breaking down the technique in slow motion, explaining the principles of leverage, balance, and timing that made it effective. As he taught, something subtle began to change in how the women perceived him. His movements, when demonstrated slowly and deliberately, showed precision and economy that suggested far more training than his appearance indicated. An hour into the workshop, they were interrupted by voices in the hallway outside the multipurpose room. Loud, aggressive voices that were clearly not part of any community center activity. Through the room's windows, they could see 3 young men in their early 20s walking through the community center's main corridor. They wore loose clothing that could conceal weapons, moved with the aggressive swagger of people looking for trouble, and were clearly not there for any legitimate community center purpose. Sandra Williams appeared in the doorway of the multipurpose room, her face pale with concern. "I've called the police," she said quietly, "but they're still 20 minutes away. These guys just walked in demanding money from everyone they see." The women in the workshop looked around nervously. The community center's layout offered limited escape routes, and the multipurpose room where they'd been training was at the end of a corridor with only one exit. "Everyone stay calm," Frank said, his voice carrying a note of authority that hadn't been there during the instruction. "Move to the far side of the room, away from the door. Sandra, lock the door and turn off the lights." But before Williams could move, the door burst open, and the 3 intruders entered the room. They were young, probably between 20 and 25 years old, and clearly under the influence of something that made them both aggressive and unpredictable. Well, what do we have here?" said the apparent leader, a thin man with tattoos covering his arms and neck. "Looks like a room full of ladies with purses and jewelry, and one old man trying to play hero." His companions, both larger and more obviously muscular, positioned themselves to block the room's only exit. "This is going to be easy," one of them said. "Nobody needs to get hurt if you just hand over your valuables." The women in the room were frozen with terror. This was exactly the kind of situation they'd come to the workshop to prepare for, but nothing in their comfortable suburban lives had prepared them for the reality of being confronted by actual predators. Frank stepped forward, placing himself between the intruders and the women. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and conversational, "this is a community center. These are just people trying to learn some basic safety techniques. There's nothing of value here worth taking." The leader laughed. "Old man, you need to sit down and shut up before you get hurt. We'll take whatever we want from whoever we want." Frank's posture didn't change, but something subtle shifted in his bearing. The casual slouch disappeared, replaced by a stillness that was somehow more menacing than any aggressive stance would have been. "I'm going to ask you once to leave," Frank said. "After that, I'm going to make you leave." The 3 intruders looked at each other and burst into laughter. The leader was the first to stop laughing. "You're kidding, right? Look at yourself, old man. You're about to get a beating that'll put you in the hospital." He stepped forward, reaching out to shove Frank backward in the classic prelude to a more serious assault. What happened next took place so quickly that most of the women in the room missed the details entirely. Frank moved with the fluid precision of someone for whom violence was not an emergency, but a familiar tool. The leader's aggressive approach became a liability. As Frank redirected his forward momentum, using the attacker's own force to send him crashing into the wall with an impact that cracked the drywall, the second attacker rushed forward, and Frank met him with a series of precise strikes to nerve centers and pressure points that dropped him to his knees, gasping and unable to coordinate his movements. The third intruder, seeing his companions neutralized in a matter of seconds, pulled a knife from his pocket and waved it threateningly. Frank's response was immediate and decisive. He closed the distance before the knife wielder could react, disarmed him with a technique that left the young man's wrist clearly broken, and put him on the ground next to his companions. The entire confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. 3 young criminals who had entered the room with total confidence in their ability to intimidate and rob a room full of suburban women now lay on the floor, disabled but not seriously injured, waiting for police, who was still 15 minutes away. The women stared at Frank in absolute silence. The soft-looking, overweight man who had shuffled to the front of the room an hour earlier had just demonstrated a level of combat proficiency that belonged in action movies, not community center workshops. Sarah Chun was the first to find her voice. "Mr. Mitchell, what the hell was that?" Frank looked around the room at the women who were staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to utter fear. The careful camouflage of ordinary civilian life that he'd maintained for 8 years had just been stripped away in 30 seconds of applied violence. That, he said quietly, was what happens when people who choose violence encounter someone trained to stop them. Jessica Martinez stepped closer, her earlier skepticism replaced by something approaching reverence. "Trained by who? Where did you learn to do that?" Frank considered his answer carefully. For 8 years, he'd lived a quiet life, deliberately avoiding situations that might require him to reveal capabilities that belonged to a different world entirely. But looking at these women, seeing how the reality of violence had shaken them, he realized that perhaps it was time to share some of what he knew. "United States Army," he said. "Special operations. I spent 22 years learning how to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently." The room remained silent as the implications of his words sank in. Special operations didn't mean regular military service. It meant elite units, classified missions, and training that turned ordinary soldiers into precision instruments of warfare. Amanda Rodriguez approached cautiously. "What unit?" Frank's hesitation lasted only a moment. "Delta Force. 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. I retired 8 years ago and came here to live a normal life." The women looked around at each other, trying to process what they'd just learned. Delta Force was legendary even among special operations units, representing the absolute pinnacle of American military capability. They were the unit called in when other elite forces encountered situations beyond their capabilities. Chun asked the question that everyone was thinking. "If you're Delta Force, why are you teaching self-defense at a community center? Why aren't you working for the government or training other soldiers?" Frank looked down at the 3 intruders who were slowly beginning to regain their mobility. The police sirens were getting closer, and soon he'd have to explain to law enforcement how 3 young criminals had ended up disabled on a community center floor. "Because," he said, "after 22 years of killing people in places most Americans can't pronounce, I wanted to try saving people in a place where I might actually make a difference." Over the next hour, as police took statements and arrested the 3 would-be robbers, Frank's story began to emerge. Frank "Ghost" Mitchell had joined the army. At 18, completed Ranger training, Special Forces qualification, and finally selection for Delta Force, where he'd spent 15 years conducting classified missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, and a dozen other countries that couldn't be named in official reports. His call sign "Ghost" had come from his ability to infiltrate enemy positions without being detected, to move through hostile territory without leaving traces, and to eliminate high-value targets while leaving no evidence of American involvement. He'd participated in operations that had prevented terrorist attacks, rescued hostages, and eliminated threats to American national security. But the cost of that career had been enormous. 3 marriages destroyed by classified deployments and psychological distance. Children who grew up barely knowing their father. Friends and teammates lost in operations that couldn't be publicly acknowledged or mourned. When he'd finally reached retirement eligibility, Frank had chosen to disappear into civilian life as completely as possible. He'd moved to Phoenix, a city where he knew no one and no one knew him. He'd deliberately gained weight, adopted the appearance and mannerisms of an ordinary retiree, and avoided any activities that might attract attention or require him to use skills that belonged to his former life. But 8 years of deliberate ordinariness hadn't erased 2 decades of elite training. When violence entered that community center room, Frank's response had been automatic and overwhelming. As the police finished their investigation and the other women prepared to leave, Martinez approached Frank with a question that would change both their lives. "Mr. Mitchell, would you be willing to teach a real self-defense class?" Not just awareness and basic techniques, but actual preparation for situations like what we just experienced. Frank considered her request. For 8 years, he'd avoided any involvement in activities that might require him to reveal his capabilities, but what had just happened demonstrated the gap between civilian preparation and reality-based threats. These women had come to learn self-defense and had encountered actual violence before they'd learned anything useful. They'd been helpless in a situation where basic techniques might have saved their lives. Perhaps it was time to bridge that gap. I could teach you things that would be effective, Frank said, but it wouldn't be the kind of gentle, confidence-building class you signed up for today. Real preparation for dangerous situations requires understanding violence as it actually exists, not as we wish it would be. The women looked at each other, then back at Frank. After what they'd just experienced, gentle and confidence building seemed less important than actually being prepared. Rodriguez spoke for the group. Mr. Mitchell, we want to learn whatever you're willing to teach us. Over the following months, Frank Mitchell's self-defense classes became legendary in Phoenix. Word spread through social media, neighborhood groups, and personal recommendations about the unassuming instructor who taught women how to defend themselves with military-grade effectiveness. His classes were different from anything offered by traditional martial arts schools or conventional self-defense programs. Frank taught situational awareness with the paranoia of someone who'd survived in hostile territories. He taught threat assessment with the precision of someone who'd had to identify enemies in civilian populations. He taught physical techniques with the ruthless efficiency of someone who'd learned that second place in violent encounters meant death. But perhaps most importantly, he taught his students to think like predators in order to avoid becoming prey. He explained how criminals selected targets, how they set up attacks, how they exploited the normalcy bias that kept most people from recognizing danger until it was too late. His students learned to move through the world with the awareness of people who understood that violence was always possible, always close, and always preventable if you knew how to see it coming. The 3 women from that first workshop became his assistant instructors, helping him teach techniques they'd learned through months of intensive training. Chun learned knife defense and weapon retention. Martinez specialized in escape and evasion techniques. Rodriguez became expert in situational awareness and threat recognition. Together, they taught hundreds of women throughout the Phoenix area, sharing knowledge that Frank had accumulated over 2 decades of professional violence, but adapting it for civilian self-protection rather than military operations. Frank's reputation spread beyond civilian self-defense. Police departments began requesting his assistance with tactical training. Military veterans struggling with the transition to civilian life sought him out for guidance on applying military skills to peaceful purposes. He worked with domestic violence shelters, teaching women who'd escaped abusive relationships how to recognize and counter the tactics their former partners might use to track and harm them. He taught corporate security teams how to identify and respond to workplace violence before it escalated to tragedy. Most importantly, he taught other veterans how to channel their combat experience into protective rather than destructive purposes, showing them that the skills they'd learned in war could be used to make their communities safer rather than more dangerous. The overweight, unassuming man who'd shuffled to the front of a community center room had revealed himself to be one of America's most elite warriors. But more than that, he'd demonstrated that true strength often comes disguised as ordinariness, that the most dangerous people are often the ones who look least dangerous, and that expertise and in the world's most violent places could be transformed into tools for protecting the innocent. Frank Mitchell learned that retirement from military service didn't mean retirement from service entirely. It meant finding new ways to apply old skills, new purposes for hard-won capabilities, and new methods for making a difference in a world that still contained people willing to prey on others. The 3 gang members who burst into that community center room expecting to find easy victims had instead encountered a legend who'd been hiding in plain sight. They'd learned, in 30 seconds of precise violence, that assumptions about people's capabilities based on their appearance are often catastrophically wrong. But perhaps the more important lesson belonged to the women who'd witnessed Frank's transformation from unremarkable instructor to elite warrior. They'd learned that heroes don't always look heroic, that protection can come from unexpected sources, and that the person you underestimate today might be the one who saves your life tomorrow. 8 years of deliberate invisibility had ended in 30 seconds of necessary action. Frank Mitchell was no longer just a quiet retiree living in Phoenix. He was a bridge between the world of elite military capability and civilian self-protection, a teacher who could prepare ordinary people for extraordinary circumstances, and a reminder that sometimes the most valuable gifts come wrapped in the most unassuming packages. If this story changed how you think about judging people by their appearance, if it made you realize that expertise often hides behind ordinary facades, then share it with someone who needs to understand that strength comes in many forms. Remember that the person sitting quietly in the back of the room might be the one with the most to offer. Honor the Frank Mitchells in your community, the quiet professionals who've served in ways they can't discuss, but who continue to serve in ways that make everyone safer. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes and unexpected guardians, and hit that like button if you believe that true warriors protect the innocent regardless of recognition or reward. In the comments below, tell us about a time when someone surprised you by revealing capabilities you never suspected. Let's celebrate the moments when assumptions crumble and heroes reveal themselves.